If you've been hurt and it hurts real bad, or if you have feelings that are making you sad, then it's okay to cry.
Let's play a word association game. I'm going to say something and I want you to really take a moment to really dwell on it and think of things that come to mind when I say this. Think of the associations, the characteristics, the ideas that this particular word bring up. I'm going to give you a moment too after I say it to really flush it out. The word is vampires. Now, there exists a certain subsect of mythological creatures that the majority of us are familiar with today. They've been in pop culture and literature and movies, different forms of entertainment, different media, through many, many years. Vampires is one of them. There are other ones too, werewolves and Frankenstein's monster and mummy. In fact, if you were to name characteristics about that without specifically naming them themselves, more than likely people would be able to tell you what they were. If I said, is hurt by silver bullets and transforms under a full moon, you'd probably be inclined to say werewolf. If I said wrapped in bandages and a pharaoh's curse, you might say the mummy. If I said brought to life by electricity in a mad scientist's laboratory with bolts in the neck, you'd say Frankenstein's monster. And vampires are no different. There seem to be characteristics that are just associated with them, that everybody brings to mind when you mention them. Now granted, there are two different takes, kind of a divergence almost, of what we think of when we think of vampires. Now you'll have the more action-oriented kind of person who will say things like, can transform into bats, is impervious to damage, is only hurt with crucifixes or garlic or sunlight, gets whipped occasionally by some crazy fucker named Belmont. On the other hand, you might have some say, is a Lothario, a seductor of women, feeds on blood, a very sexual entity. The truth is, though, both of these kind of differing viewpoints are really part of a whole. If you were to name either of those, more than likely somebody was going to say vampire, even if they lean more one way than the other. Now, those words that you brought up, the ideas that you brought up when you thought of vampire, I'm going to guess probably included some of the things I just listed. And that makes sense when you think about it, because whether it's Bram Stoker or Anne Rice, whether it's the Blade trilogy or the Twilight series, our ideas of what a vampire is are fairly well defined. We all pretty much have an idea of exactly what they are because we've been exposed to so many different forms of media regarding them that it's created a concrete image in our minds. Now, if anywhere on that particular list you happen to say rapist, well, more than likely you'd be Kat Bailey, a writer over at US Gamer. She recently posted an article about Castlevania Lords of Darkness 2, in which she went on to talk about things that she found problematic after sitting down with a developer and getting a first look at the game. And since the focus of this series is over hypersensitivity on the internet, I thought we could take a moment and find out just what was so problematic that Kat had to write an article about it. So join me on this journey into the mind of an insane person as we venture forward and find out exactly what makes Dracula such a horrible sex offender. So here's the article in question. Yes, Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2 did make me feel uncomfortable. How one scene may end up unintentionally defining a game by trivializing sexual assault for the sake of easy shock value. And as you can see from the screenshot, this was published fairly recently. I actually had somebody send me a link to it because I'm guessing like I was, they were completely shocked at how fucking retarded this is. So I'm going to skim through the article. Now, if you want to read the whole thing in its entirety, it is a fairly long article. If I were to read it verbatim, this would be a 30-minute video. So I'm just going to go to the important bits, but I will include a link in the video description if you want to go read it yourself to make sure that I'm not making this up. So let's take a look at a few of the things that she had a problem with, and she gets right to it, right at the very beginning of the article. I'm sitting in a roundtable interview with a handful of journalists after having spent more than an hour playing Lords of Shadow 2. The scene in question being one in which a withered Dracula stumbled toward a family with his arms outstretched. The camera abruptly switching to a first-person perspective. He kills the father outright, then grabs the mother and sinks his fangs into her neck, draining her energy to restore his life. Sexual imagery is nothing new in vampire fiction, but this scene is kind of stunning for how blatant it is with its allusion to rape. It's a scene that forcibly reminds me of the box art from Rapeplay, down to the woman protecting her child and the disembodied arms, your arms, reaching out for the camera. Regardless of the intentions in constructing the scene, the imagery is ghastly. Now, for those of you wondering, what in the hell is Rapeplay? It is a 2006 Japanese hentai game in which you are the main protagonist, a serial rapist, and the goal of the game is to rape a mother and her two young daughters. Now, already, we're 2 paragraphs in, And you can already see how insane this is. Now, remember back to the beginning of the video when I asked you, think of things that you normally associate with vampires or Dracula. What are those images? What are the iconic images we have of Dracula? When he feeds on blood, and that's what he does, that's what vampires do, who do we see him victimize? Is it strong men? Do we see Dracula grabbing a buff, man who is ripped with muscles and gleaming with sweat, wearing a hard hat and holding a pickaxe? No, of course not. We see Dracula, we see vampires as almost a predatory force that uses sexuality to lure in women and feeds on them. That's his allure. He is a Lothario, as I said earlier. So her first complaint is that he kills the father and then feeds on the woman. And she says that is comparable to a game in which you are a serial rapist. Now, you really need to take a moment and step the fuck back and think about what the hell she just said. Again, I really want you to think back to all the media you've ever seen concerning vampires. I guarantee you, 10 to 1. 90% of the time, when a vampire is feeding, it is going to be feeding on the opposite sex. If the vampire is female, it will feed on a male. If the vampire is male, it will feed on a female. That is just part of the mythos, the mythology around the fucking thing. So to act like these developers have done something that's completely, unheard of, that this, oh my god, how dare a vampire feed on a female? What is the argument here? That we need sexual equality in the victimization by mythological creatures? Dracula, we need to bring you down to the HR office and have you sit down and fill out a few forms and get some sensitivity training. You need to start sucking guys off a little bit more than you're sucking women. Okay, because you're not hitting the quota. We have a checklist here. I'm seeing that you're favoring women 65%. That's just not going to cut it. I'm sorry. We have laws we have to follow, and you need to be more diverse in your predatory behaviors. Now, I've been accused of hyperbole and rhetoric, and by God, that's completely accurate. In one of the videos I did, I said that feminism will be the death of gaming. Obviously hyperbole. But this is taking it a step way beyond that. To compare a normal behavior known and associated with a mythological creature and to say that it invokes in you the imagery of a game where you brutally rape people is crazy. Now, I think one of the more interesting bits is right after this. Now, she sets up the article to make it look like Cox, the developer, and when he's talking about this, when he's talking about the characterization they're giving the main character in the game, is intentionally doing this. That he is trying to make you think, he's trying to trigger you. He's trying to make you have flashbacks of all those almost rapes you suffered on Tumblr. But look at what he really says. Okay, I'm going to read it verbatim from the article. The scene caused a lot of discussions, I should say between us and the marketing guys, because they felt we went a bit too far. But we thought, this is not going to be a Twilight vampire or a True Blood vampire. This is going to be a vampire who is gritty, who does evil. Coming back to what vampires used to be. Scary evil. That's how we want to present it, and that scene does it very well. I think it achieved what we wanted it to achieve, and it comes at a moment in the game when it's quite surprising. The family scene is one of those scenes where I guess if we were a little bit more timid about things, we probably wouldn't have included that. Now, we feel a bit more justified. The popularity of the first game reinforced our strength. The freedom to do what we want and break some rules to do things in a different way. Cox goes on further. A little later he talks about the team's goals for the character of Dracula. Players want heroes who are more sophisticated. They want heroes that have a backstory. They want heroes that are believable. If we had portrayed Dracula as this sort of rage monster that was angry at the world, it wouldn't work anymore. Our Dracula has a lot more to him as a character, and if players are going to play a 20-hour game, they need to be able to identify with that character. This comes off as completely disingenuous journalism. The way she has structured this article, her opening, talking about her complaint, about seeing this as an allusion to rape, how this scene is a victimization of women, it's a sexual assault. What is it followed up by? What is the very next thing we're presented with as a reader? We are presented with the development team, with Cox, talking about the character itself and this particular scene. When he's talking about the main protagonist in the game, what is he saying? Well, he wants a vampire that's more old school. Scary and evil, it's flawed. You as the player are taking control of a character that is not your typical hero. It's a monster. It's back to its roots. It's a bad fucking thing. The way it's structured, though, the way this article is presented, the narrative is put forward to the reader, makes it seem, or it's implied, that Cox is referring to her allegations, that he is acknowledging that this is obviously a rape scene, and that they're being edgy by having, the main character do this. Like, Dracula is now a rapist because we can get away with it because the first game was successful. When he's talking about the character, and then he goes on to discuss the scene, what does he refer to it as? The family scene. He's saying we could push the boundaries. We could do things we might not necessarily have been able to do with a brand new intellectual property because of the success of the first game. And what is that exactly? You are killing parents in front of their kid, and you're doing it in the first person. This has nothing to do with rape. And when he is talking about this scene, when he is describing what is going on and the motivations for the character, you can see that. It's fucking obvious what he's talking about. And yet, Kate has set this article up to make it seem like, oh no, he really, wink wink, nudge nudge, he's really implying that, yeah, this is edgy stuff made to be related to rape. And it's fucking not. Now, maybe you'd like further proof that she is being disingenuous and this is bullshit. This is the very next piece of this article. With that said, I'd like to take a moment to disagree with Cox's assertions. It may be that Dracula ends up being a more sophisticated character, but the imagery in the family scene is problematic for other reasons. First, the way this scene is constructed isn't accidental. When Cox talks about wanting to take risks in arguments with the marketing team, it's clear that this scene was constructed with the intention of evoking sexual assault. Are you for real, Kat Bailey? Do you have any journalistic integrity whatsoever? To make it seem like he is talking about sexual assault, then to go forward and say that he's kind of tangentially admitting this with your fucking narrative is infuriating. It is a joke. Is there any shred of decency and work ethic in you? Is there a sense of professionalism which dwells deep within you that would make you feel ashamed for what you're trying to do here? And it is obvious what you are trying to do here. You are not that clever. To try to set it up to make it look like Cox is admitting this is a rape scene, and that you've caught them, and that their intention was evoking sexual assault. Nowhere was that implied, nowhere did they say that, nowhere did they hint at that. And yet you have put forward a narrative to try to put those words in their mouth, and then to try to take some moral high ground and, point your finger at them and say how terrible that is. Kat Bailey goes on further to say that it's being used almost exclusively for shock value serves to trivialize a very real horror that women deal with every day. What is that exactly? Being assaulted by mythological creatures? Is there a charity out there that I can donate to that will help victims of vampires get on with their lives? But Kat isn't done yet. Oh no. The next part says, second, you're not meant to sympathize with the victim, a young woman who doesn't even rate a name or personality. You are meant to sympathize with Dracula. In the moment that camera shifts from third person to first person, you are Dracula. You might feel horror at what he's done, but that doesn't change the fact that it's the point of view of the attacker. It's more than a little reminiscent of high-profile sexual assault cases in which the accused is endlessly profiled and discussed, while the victim is reduced to little more than a prop. What in the fuck are you talking about? I want to know exactly what the argument here is. Let's put aside everything else. Hell, let's take it at face value. Let's say that Kate Bailey isn't insane, and that she is completely right, and that Cox didn't just hint at it. He actually came out in the interview and said, you know what? Start of the game, Dracula's going to rape a few people. She goes on to say how terrible this is. It trivializes rape. We don't know anything about the attacker and how that alludes to high-profile sexual assault cases. I'm playing a video game, a 20-hour video game, in which I am taking control of a character. Who do you think I want to relate to on that 20-hour journey? Victim number 482 or the actual main character, the person I'm going to be playing the game as for 20 hours? Could you imagine this philosophy applied to movies? You go in to see a 2-hour Quentin Tarantino movie, and the random asshole that gets shot in the bank, and I don't know, let's say Reservoir Dogs, the scene where he shoots up the bank. Should Tarantino have made the movie 5 hours long so we could find out the fucking backstory of the people that got shot in the bank? Because otherwise we're trivializing people who have been in bank holdups and have been hostages and have been shot. It is a ludicrous argument. And it is a ludicrous argument that is founded on fucking falsehoods, which is even more infuriating. But the real cherry on top of the shit sundae is this line in the second to the last paragraph. So while I applaud Cox and his team for their desire to take on challenging material, I really hope they cut the family scene before Lords of Shadow 2 launches next month. Kat Bailey, fuck you and fuck people like you. This mentality is getting out of control, and it has happened before, and it has never led to anything good or creative or entertaining. You cannot look at the era of the Hollywood blacklist and tell me that turned out well. You cannot look at the comic book authority and the comic book code and tell me that the comics turned out better because of it. We are talking about the same people that would advocate for banning books like R.L. Stein's Goosebumps. You remember that ludicrous bullshit? Where they wanted those out of school libraries because they were just too much for the children? Or Catcher in the Rye has a few bad words in it, let's pull that. This censorship mentality that seems to be running amok? I mean, that's bad enough. It is bad enough that mentality even exists. But when it exists for imagined insults and imagined problems, it is even worse. This is just another classic example of gaming journalism gone completely off the rails. You can add it to the list right next to Kotaku and the rock, paper, shotguns of the world that manufacture controversies that don't exist and insert social justice bullshit where it doesn't belong. And believe me, we are not talking about gaming anymore. We are talking about social justice. Those are her words, not mine. She herself states, this is a social justice issue. Now, I could end this video here. I think I've shown enough to show you that this is just ridiculous. But you know what? I'm going to play devil's advocate. I'm going to advocate for putting rape into video games. Now, what are the main complaints these people always bring up when something hurts their feelings? That you're trivializing victims, that this is making abuse seem like it's fun, or that you're going to influence people's behaviors. How is it that gamers can buy into that line of bullshit, and at the same time turn around and at the top of their fucking lungs scream out that there is no connection between violence and gaming? How can you tell me that the Jack Thompsons of this world are completely wrong, but the Cat Baileys are completely right? It is a ridiculous double standard. There is an immense amount of violence in video games. We kill people, we dismember them, we torture them all the time. Am I trivializing a victim in COD because I teabag them? Should I hold a memorial service and run a charity drive? How many people do you think get killed from gun violence? All those studies and all those news articles and all those Fox specials talking about how we're breeding a new generation of killers, you're going to tell me those are wrong when the same logic they use is what's being applied here? Which is it? It's all or nothing. You can't really dodge this. Either games influence people and they trivialize victims and they're terrible and we should get rid of them, or it's all bullshit and these people are hypersensitive. You can't have both. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You know, where was the moral outrage when Edgy May Cry had one of their main protagonists? You remember, the one with the big dick.
And I got a bigger dick.
Do this.
The fuck?
Oh no!
I don't remember seeing Kotaku scream their heads off about that. I don't remember Rock, Paper, Shotgun doing it. I don't remember Giant Bomb bitching about it. Oh no, they praised it because it was rubbing it in the faces of the fans that love the franchise. What are some of the other arguments we constantly see? That we want it to be an art form, and fuck Ebert for saying that it can never be that. That it's a mature thing, that it can rival novels and movies and television, that it can really be more than just a game. How is that ever going to be accomplished when you constantly shoot yourself in the foot anytime somebody tries to do something creative or different? Now here she's manufacturing that there's some sexual abuse, that there's victimization taking place. Let's talk about a game where that actually happens, where it's not make-believe, but it's actually in the game. Let's talk about, I don't know, Xenogears. Now Xenogears is a fantastic RPG. A lot of people love it. It goes for a good amount of money on eBay and at different secondhand shops, and the downloads available for it are still pretty popular. Now in the game you meet a 16-year-old boy named Billy. He becomes a party member. When you first meet him and he's talking about how he survived, how he bought food for him and his family, he just happens to mention very bluntly that he was a child prostitute, that he fucked older men to get money to support himself. Could you imagine the shitstorm these idiots would have over that? If that game were released today, if it were a brand new game, and that was in there, could you imagine the shitstorm they would kick up over it? How is it that you can say you want complex characters and you want depth in video games, and you want art in video games, and you want them to compete with movies and novels, and yet anytime somebody tries to fucking insert anything that's above and beyond some 2D cutout, you flip your shit, because it's not being handled in the way you want it to be handled in. Art and entertainment isn't always comfortable. It's not meant to be. Sometimes it's meant to invoke or provoke different emotions and reactions. But the one that you always stick with, the one they always default to, is being offended. There has to be a point where common sense prevails, where people say fiction is not real life. We can identify that there are differences. Because something bad happens in a game or a novel or a movie does not mean that we endorse it in real life. Those are components, they are pieces that make up the picture, a bigger whole for us to take in. And you are holding back the medium by constantly whining about shit. Probably the reason you're never going to see another line like that from Xenogears in a video game is because these hypersensitive assholes would never allow it. So when you hear a developer saying they're willing to take a fucking risk, you should at least support them, because they're breaking out of the mold even a little bit. To try to get away from the cookie cutter shit and the 9,000 COD sequels and the 9,000 Madden sequels and do something fucking different for once. But why is it that every time they try to do something different, they're cut off at the fucking kneecaps by these people, by social justice warriors that want to bring in their bullshit real-world issues and try to infuse them into everything? It's fiction. These things are not real. If you don't believe me, maybe you'll believe Max.
There's something my dad made up, which is he told me when I was little and I was frustrated about rules in movies. He said, how do you kill a vampire? And I was like, stake through the heart, garlic, sunlight. And my dad was like, no, you can kill a vampire however the fuck you want because vampires don't fucking exist.